compliance with legal agreements and financial performance in accordance with monitoring processes, policies, guidelines, framework, and practices. And also to provide early warning signals and remedial actions through timeous collection and analysis of financial and operational reports through risk classification framework. Based on the inputs that are received from the associates, the manager further prepares consolidated global portfolio reports for submissions to the 3 clients, which are Government Employees Pension Fund, GPF, Unemployment Insurance Fund, the UIF, and the Compensation Fund, CF. As a portfolio manager, I directly report to the senior manager, who in turn reports to the executive head of investment management.
Can I just ask in relation to the process that you outlined, and it may be covered a little further on, but if you had to deal with an entity in your post-monitoring process that is in distress, do you cover that later?
Yes.
So that you can look at how you deal with the beginnings of a distress and what happens subsequent to that?
Yes, Commissioner, it's covered in subsequent sections. The portfolio management and valuation process. The processes and activities provided in this statement do not reflect the entire ambit of the PMV department, but are meant to provide the context within which MST and the SNS transactions were monitored. Where the roles of other departments are mentioned in this statement, it's for the purposes of highlighting their interlinkages and their alignment with the PMV department. So the first process we start with is the handover meeting. The PMV department is a support function of the impact investing team, that is the transaction team. The PMV team only gets involved once conditions precedent, which is CPs, have been fulfilled, and the Isibaya operations team has finalized the disbursement file. The handover is effected at a handover meeting that is convened by the Isibaya operations team, and the handover meeting is also attended by other relevant departments, including the transaction team, investment finance, environmental and social and governance, and risk. The purpose of this meeting is to onboard, amongst others, PMV in relation to the transaction. At the meeting, the transaction team briefs the participants about the essential features of a transaction, focusing, amongst others, on the key aspects of the transaction to ensure a common understanding. An attendance register is circulated and signed by all in attendance and is filed in the disbursement file. Once the handover process is completed, the transaction will now move to the disbursement stage. In order for a disbursement to be made, the Isibaya operations team prepares a disbursement memo on the basis of which the payment or disbursement will be made. Signatories to the disbursement memo are, amongst others, the Isibaya operations team itself, PMV, the fund principals, which are from the transaction team, ESG, and legal, and all subsequent disbursements where an investee company draws down on the committed funds in tranches are signed by the same departments. The purpose of PMV's signature on the memo is to confirm that, amongst others, there is no non-compliance on the part of the investee company with, amongst others, the drawdown conditions as set out in the transaction agreements. For subsequent disbursements, a PMV manager's signature serves to confirm that no events that have taken place that would warrant withholding a payment. Where there are reasons to withhold a payment, PMV would generally seek to resolve such issues. Once the portfolio manager signs the memo, the PMV department plays no further role in the processing of the memo.
But how do you satisfy yourselves that everything has been done correctly? Risk assessments, whatever other assessments have been done correctly?
Through you, Commissioner, are you asking at the transaction, the first disbursement or the subsequent?
Whichever one it is, where you satisfy yourselves that we can now sign and monies can be paid out.
In the first disbursement, you would have a disbursement file that contains all transaction documents as well as a CP satisfaction letter from the legal team. or the external legal counsel. And you would generally go through a transaction agreement to get the salient features of the transaction and see that the utilization notice sets out all representations and warranties by the client. And thereafter, there's an email that is circulated by an associate who also does the same process of satisfying themselves that everything is in the file as indicated by the CP satisfaction letter. So based on that email and the supporting documentation, you're able to then say whether or not this as PMV you are comfortable with providing signature. The second process is PMV client engagement. After the first disbursement, the PMV team initiates contact for the purpose of an introductory meeting with the investee company and to confirm that there is a common understanding of the reporting requirements, the framework and/or mechanism as stipulated in the legal agreements. The team collates information for the analysis of the investment directly from the investee company through client meetings, site visits, and sometimes from the deal teams. The PMV typically informs and invites the transaction team, finance team, and ESG team to the meetings, and where possible, those teams attend the meetings with PMV. The PMV monitoring functions. The main role of the PMV is to monitor compliance by the investee companies with the requirements of the transaction agreements. In monitoring the transactions, the focus areas of the PMV team are as follows: financial analysis, sector or industry analysis, which is also the operating environment, adherence to reporting undertakings, that's the submission of budgets, management accounts, audited financial statements, or any other requirement as specified in the legal agreement. We also have lessons learned compilations to the extent that they're identifiable recurrent performance detractors visible across a particular sector or portfolio of investments. PMV provides an analysis of the lessons that have been learned, and this is also submitted to the various committees to assist the committee members in the consideration of new transactions that may fall within those problematic areas. Depending on the outcomes of the monitoring activities that PMV performs, there are remedial actions that may from time to time need to be taken. In this regard, PMV's task would typically relate to initiating the documentation which relates to the following matters: consents and/or waiver of breaches, default letters, request for restructuring, or corporate actions. Where PMC approval is required for a particular subject matter, PMV would generate documentation taking into account input from other relevant departments which co-sign on the document. So a submission of this nature would go through the following process. First, it is compiled by an associate, taking into account inputs from the transaction team, who will also sign off on the document as co-compilers. Secondly, it is reviewed by a portfolio manager, taking into account inputs from the associate principal from the transaction team, who will also sign off the document as co-reviewer. Third, it is submitted for further consideration to the senior manager of PMV, who will also sign off on the document as a reviewer. Fourth, it is submitted to the executive heads of investment management, risk, and legal for recommendation. And finally, it is submitted to the executive head of impact investing for approval, or it would be impact investing or private equity in the way it applies, for approval of that submission of the document to the PMC. Based on the financial and operational analysis, PMV also undertakes a performance rating exercise of the investments, and to this end, PMV classifies each investment according to a set of criteria which categorize the investment performance under the following buckets. You have performing, underperforming, watch list, and distressed. Distressed investments. Where an investment has been classified as watch list or distressed, the matter is dealt with either by PMV itself, working with other departments, or it is referred to the PMC unlisted with recommendations, depending on the severity of distress and the risk profile. Such recommendations may include the appointment of an independent consultant to provide an in-depth and comprehensive analysis of the business with the view to provide turnaround strategies. In terms of PMV reporting, PMV prepares and submits quarterly reports on its activities, including those that have been described above. The reporting committees. There are two forms of reporting and/or approvals that PMV does and requires, namely the quarterly monitoring reports and ad hoc reports, which are the ad hoc reports are necessitated by remedial actions that are from time to time required. The latter reports and/or approvals are submitted to the PMC. The quarterly monitoring reports must be submitted to the following committees strictly in this order: the Finance and Valuations Committee, the Portfolio Management Committee for PMV, unlisted, which is also called PMC for PMV, the Fund Investment Panels, which are FIPS, and/or the Investment Committee. Now, on the Finance and Valuations Committee, this is the first committee that PMV submits its quarterly monitoring reports to. Two other departments, that is Finance and Risk, also compile and submit their respective reports to the FVC. The Finance team submits valuations reports, and the Risk team submits impairment reports. The Valuations Committee deliberates on the valuation reports from the Finance team, taking into account the monitoring report of PMV and the impairment report of the Risk team where it applies. The FVC then resolves on what valuation figures should be adopted for the quarter based on the information that has been provided by the different teams. It should be noted as part of the monitoring processes that for the quarter ending March of any year, PMV does not compile quarterly reports, as this being the period after the financial year of the PIC, all unlisted investments are assessed by external independent valuers as part of the general year-end valuations process. PMV's involvement with that process is to provide comments on draft valuation reports generated by the external valuers. The interaction with external valuers, including provision of information and submission of comments, is generally coordinated by the Finance team. PMC for PMV. After the FVC meeting is concluded, PMV updates the quarterly monitoring reports on the basis of the valuation figure that has been adopted by FVC, and then submits the updated reports to the PMCs for PMV. The reports would now contain the investment valuation of that instrument for the reporting quarter. The PMC for PMV deliberates on these investment reports and then approves onward submission of those reports to the respective fund investment panels and IC. From the PMC for PMV, the reports are submitted to either a FIP or the IC for approval, depending on the committee that approved the transaction in the first place. There are two different FIPs, one for social and economic infrastructure and environmental sustainability, and the other for the private equity, priority sector, and SME, which is PEPs. The two FIPs are differentiated by sector of focus. Where a transaction was approved by the IC or a structure below the relevant FIP, the PMV's reports are still submitted to the relevant FIP for information and/or noting purposes.
At this point in time, she's going to then move to S&S refineries.
Monitoring of the S&S refineries transaction. Handover. This investment was inherited in July 2016 from a different PMV team 2 years after the investment date and after all disbursements had been made to the client. The plant had its first production run in April 2016. From the period July 2016, when both myself and the PMV associate, Mr. Lesego Motupi, took over the transaction, we were introduced to the plant manager of SNS Refineries, Mr. Jose Ferreira Castro. The introduction was through an email from the transactor, Mr. Tsepo Rapudi, wherein he requested that the plant manager to include the new PMV team on all correspondence going forward.
Can I stop you there? At the time you inherited the transaction, did the previous PMV team give you the file on and everything that they had done that far?
Yes, they did give us the quarterly reports and the files so we could onboard ourselves. In October...
Just for my edification, how many PMVs are there? Is it one at a time? I see the first point. You say you inherited in July 2016 from a different PMV team.
Thank you, Commissioner. This is in reference to a reshuffle within the team where a transaction is moved from a different manager to another manager or from a different associate to another associate. So in this instance, both myself and the associate were given the transaction because of changes in the team and a reallocation of investments within the team. But it would mean the same team. It's just a different responsible manager and associate.
Is it usual to change a team in the middle of a process like that?
Yes, it has happened before, where initially the allocation of investments was based on the portfolio mandate, which would be one of the different funds. At a later stage, it was determined that it would be more beneficial to have associates focusing specifically on sectors so they can establish a particular sector experience, and then it would enable them to be to analyze differences or make comparisons of investments that are exposed to the same sector and provide a more informed overview of that sector and the performance of those investments. So it has happened before where we move them around, and sometimes it may be because one particular sector is deploying funds faster than others, and you end up with an associate who is overburdened with more transactions than the others. So in those instances, we will do a reshuffle and move some investments away from the one that is overburdened to one who has less to report on. In October 2016, we received from the plant manager management's account as of July 2016. The accounts reflected operating losses. Further to that, the manager provided sales and collections information, which reflected that more than 2/3 of what had been invoiced by SNS Refineries to the off-taker was outstanding from the production runs that had taken place between April and June 2016. Between July and September 2016, production was suspended due to working capital challenges, which affected procurement of production inputs.
Sorry, can I just ask you there, if we looked at your point 3, the question of, if I understand that's fair, that's non-delivery.
Yes, it is, by the off-taker, yes.
So it was non-delivery. Was that for technical reasons? Because your 4 talks about working capital challenges. Was there any problem with the plant and machinery and the functioning, or was it purely finance?
It was purely finance at this point, and it has later explained the nature of the problem and how it arose. During October, we were informed by the plant manager that 1,000 tons of crude palm oil had been received and that production had resumed. PMV arranged to travel to the plant in Nacala, Mozambique for a first site visit and for the discussion on the plant performance and operations. On the 6th of December 2016, Mr. Motopi and myself both from PMV, and Mr. Rapudi from the impact investing team, met with Mr. Castro, the plant manager, at the SNS plant in Nakala. We took a tour of the refinery, which at the time was in production. We were introduced to the production team and some employees in the packaging team. The highly skilled roles, we're told, were filled by expatriate workers, whilst the semi and unskilled workforce was sourced locally. At the tour, we discussed the management accounts that had been provided to date and the late and intermittent payments made by the off-taker, SNS Trading, for the oil and soap that had been sold to the trading company, also owned by the sponsor, Mr. Rasool. The plant manager informed us that all salaries, wages, and other operating costs were paid directly by Mr. Rasool from his trading company, but he had not settled the full value of the invoices sent to the refinery up to that date. The plant manager also informed us that he had not received a signed contract confirming his employment, and he had escalated to the executive board members. This was worrisome to the team, and we undertook to raise it with the non-executive board members upon our return in order to have the matter attended to for proper governance. The plant manager informed us that there was a software system called Primavera that had been purchased but had not been implemented, and as such, all record keeping for production, sales, billing, and collections was done manually. He also informed us that he had no access to the bank accounts, which impeded him from fulfilling some of his duties, such as paying for the day-to-day requirements of the company. This raised concern as the absence of adequate systems and access restrictions on the bank accounts indicated an anomaly in the management of this company. Mr. Castro also advised that the management accounts were compiled with assistance from BDO auditors in Maputo. The lack of an in-house accounting function and a financial reporting team at this plant was also noted as a cause for concern for the PIC. On the 7th of December 2016, we traveled from Nakala to Maputo for a meeting with BDO Maputo to discuss budgets and forecasts. We met with Mr. Abdul Sattar Hamid, the audit partner at BDO, and requested submission of budgets and forecasts, but he was not able to provide us with the requested information on that date. The plant manager, whom we traveled with, then informed us that he would be traveling to Portugal to attend to personal matters and would contact us upon his return to continue engagements on the refinery operations. In an email to the plant manager on 7 February 2017, the PMV associate requested management accounts and budgets for the December 2016 quarter, as had been committed to. He received no response. On the 21st of February 2017, the PMV associate then emailed Mr. Sattar at BDO Maputo after failing to get a response from the plant manager. He requested the management accounts from BDO, who then responded that they would not be able to assist with the request as Mr. Jose Castro had left in December 2016 for Portugal with the information on his laptop. He would contact Mr. Rasool for more information. And a copy of this email is attached as Annexure 1. Upon our return, I informed the non-executive board members about the issues identified at this visit and requested their intervention to assist. They arranged to travel to Maputo on the 6th of March 2017 to meet Mr. and Mrs. Rasool. On the same day, the Finance and Valuations Committee meeting of 6 March 2017 took place, and in that meeting I reported that we had not received management accounts for the December 2016 quarter. I also informed the committee that the non-executive board members had in fact traveled on that day to Maputo to discuss the issues above. The CFO, Ms. Matsepo More, then requested me to urgently join them for that meeting, so I traveled to Maputo immediately to meet Mr. Rasool together with the non-executive board members at the SNS Refineries office in Maputo. We emphasized the requirement to comply with information submissions, and Mr. Rasool committed to providing these soon, and we returned to South Africa the following day. During March 2017, the PMV associate requested financial information from BDO Maputo in preparation for the evaluations process. In that email, he indicated that the absence of the information was creating challenges for the year-end valuation process. There was no response to Mr. Motopi's PMV email to BDO, which prompted him to request the assistance of the transactor in securing the information. The transactor also emailed the sponsor and auditors, reminding them that this information had been requested during the December 2016 site visit. BDO auditors then responded to the transactor's email and attached draft financial statements, and these were shared with Finance and PMV for valuation purposes. In May, the valuations team sent a valuation report for the annual independent valuations performed externally by KPMG, and as part of providing input into the year-end valuation process, the PMV associate expressed discomfort with the forecasts, which seemed aggressive, considering the intermittent production, management instability, and operational challenges which had already been identified. This view was further supported by Mr. Masekesa, and a copy of the emails is attached as Annexure 2. In 2017, Mr. Masekesa informed me that there is a new management team appointed at the refinery and that another batch of crude palm oil had been delivered to the plant and production would be commencing. I requested their contact details so I could arrange a meeting to discuss performance of the refinery. I also informed the senior manager PMV, Mr. Kayazonke, that I intended to visit the plant and requested that he accompany me on the visit, as the transactor on this investment was unable to join me on the proposed dates. On the 19th of July, I contacted the shareholder and executive board member, Mrs. Rasul, informing her of the team's intention to visit the plant and to discuss operational issues as part of our investment monitoring processes. Mrs. Rasul responded on the 27th July 2017 to confirm the visit, and travel was arranged for myself and Mr. Zonke for the 1st of August 2017. We met Mr. and Mrs. Rasul, who are the sponsor and shareholder, Mr. Mandar and Ms. Manali, who were introduced to us as the new plant and financial manager, respectively. We explained the purpose of our visit, which was to discuss the refinery's performance and reiterate the information undertakings to the PIC. Mr. Mandar, who was the plant manager, and Ms. Manali, financial manager, informed us that they had only been employed recently in the last 2 months and were undergoing induction. They, however, committed to providing detailed financial and operational reports. We were taken on a tour of the refinery and packaging stations and saw the different elements of the plant in operation. We were not able to perform a market tour to establish the popularity of the oil and soap brand due to time constraints, but we were informed that the product is sold to vendors, hawkers, and certain other retail and wholesale distributors. The export distribution channel had not yet been tested, and the product seemed to be confined to the northern province only. The managers indicated that high transportation to other regions and currency volatility meant that the price to consumers would have to be increased to recoup those distribution costs, which would result in the product being unprofitable. The managers were also considering recruiting a staff complement of around 60 permanent employees, 50 of which would be in the production department, and the remaining 10 in the administration functions such as marketing, HR, IT, and accounting. Previously, there were 20 expatriates employed at the refinery, but due to the disruption in production, only 5 remained. The vacant positions were now expected to be filled with locals from Beira.
Just on the question of expats, I'm assuming that they tend to refer to people from Portugal. Would that be the case, or are you aware of where the expats actually come from?
At this point, it was reported that the production team consisted mainly of expats from India. Yes. Critical manpower shortages for departments such as inventory and warehouse management were identified, and those exposed the refinery to risks such as pilferage and inadequate stock control. Further to this, the quality assurance lab was also not currently capacitated, which had an impact on product quality control. In the weeks after the site visit, I followed up with the refinery's managers who still had not provided the financial and operational reports as agreed at our last visit. I also discussed these challenges with Mr. Masekesa, who informed me that the transaction would now be handled by the deal team for restructuring purposes. On the 6th of October 2017, I informed the senior manager of the discussion I had had with Wellington, this is Mr. Masekesa, and in that email, I also included a letter I had drafted to be sent to the chairperson of the SS Refineries Board, requesting intervention and assistance in getting reporting information from SS Refineries. The letter highlighted the following challenges which were identified from the site visits that had been conducted by PMV and transactors. Management assessment. Management control was lacking at the refinery, and the right skills mix that would enable operational continuity had been and continued to be difficult to obtain locally. The technical and operational assessment. The lack of IT systems or company policies was an area of great concern, as had been indicated that the company relied on manual record keeping. Market assessment. The oil brand had lost market share due to the disruption in the availability of the product. To regain its market position, the product's distribution network had to be built up by a dedicated manager from the off-taker, SNS Trading, which function was absent. Financial assessment. The lack of accounting function affected the ability to comply with financial reporting requirements, and up to that period, BDO Maputo had been intermittently assisting with the compilation of financial information as a stopgap measure. Cash flow management. Mr. Rasul's management of the cash flows was adding to the liquidity challenges of the refinery. The PIC team had on different occasions requested bank statements to track cash movements on the refinery's account, but these were not received.
Sorry, can you just expand on management of cash flows? Does that mean you don't know how the money was used? It was all just cash and not necessarily recorded, reported, or used for the affairs of the company? I mean, because the difference is there's a record keeping and purpose of use. If the record keeping is inadequate but the funds are being spent on the company, that's one thing. If the record keeping is inadequate and the funds are spent on all kinds of other things, including other companies or whatever, were you able to find out what the cash flow was actually used for?
As highlighted before, we were informed by the plant manager that Mr. Rasul was only paying intermittently into the refineries from his trading company, and that would be the amounts that would be deployed to paying salaries and wages and other operating costs. But in terms of how much is he actually paid into the company or the receipts in the SS Refineries bank statements, we were not able to verify what goes in or what comes out of that account.
And is that the situation today still?
As of this date, we have not yet seen the accounts, but the investment is now being monitored by Vamara. We have met with Vamara and we've set out our reporting requirements, and we are yet to receive those details. The letter in 37 was sent to the former CEO, Dr. Dan Machila, for his signature, and on the 31st of October 2017, the letter was sent to the chairperson of SS Refineries, Mr. Roy Rajda. A copy of the letter is attached. Sometime during the quarter ending December 2017, a decision was taken by PMC to request that the investment company management teams of distressed investments should be invited to a PMC on the 4th of December 2017 to present their business overview, the challenges, and remedial strategies to address the poor performance. This request was repeatedly communicated to the client, Mrs. Razul, and the management team during the month of November over a 3-week period, and the client responded to inform that they would not be attending the meeting. Further to the PMC's invitation to the management teams of distressed investments, PMV recommended to PMC that an independent review process be undertaken on the distressed list. The process commenced in January 2018, and by February 2018, PMV had appointed an external consultant to commence the review of SS refineries, amongst other investments. The scope of the external consultant's engagement was to review the affected investment, to identify the causes of distress and non-performance, with a view to developing a workout and/or restructuring plan to rescue the company, and to present the plan for consideration and approval to the various PIC investment committees and related stakeholders. The external consultant had already started the analysis of the investment based on the information that had been provided to them by the PMV team. As I was aware of the difficulty in accessing information from the client, during February 2018, I requested that the non-executives, Mr. Rajda and Mr. Masekesa, travel to Nakala to discuss this non-compliance with the reporting by the client, as well as the repayment. Sorry, that should read as well as the repayment on the 24th of January 2018. PMV had initiated a default letter process by informing the legal department of this event of default, and a copy of this email is attached as Annexure 4. On the 1st of March 2018, we met with Mr. Razul and Mrs. Razul and the two managers, Mr. Mandar and Ms. Manali. At this meeting, I informed the shareholders and management team of the third-party business review process that had commenced, and that the PMV team would be introducing the external consultant team at a meeting to be held on the 16th of March in Maputo at the BDO offices. The client was also informed that PIC had entered into negotiations with an established operator to take over the management of the refinery, a process which was being run parallel to this PMV process and run by the deal team. The sponsor did not raise any objections to this exercise. On the 16th of March, myself and the senior manager PMV traveled to Maputo to introduce the external team, consultants team to BDO and to Mr. and Mrs. Razul, both of whom did not attend the meeting, although notice had been given to them prior to the meeting. We explained the role of the consultant being to assess the operations and financial position of the refinery for the purposes of advising PIC of potential turnaround strategies. Pursuant to that meeting, the consultant had various correspondence with BDO Maputo and Mrs. Razul requesting financial information. They informed PMV of the difficulty of getting information from both the auditors and management team. Also during March, the external valuers KPMG requested information on SNS refineries for the annual independent valuation of the investment, but also met with challenges in accessing the required forecasts. They contacted Mrs. Razul and the two managers, but did not get any response from them. The lack of information reported by KPMG was escalated to the board members, and on the 9th of April, another request for information was sent by PMV to the client, again requesting compliance and notifying them of the repeated default in information undertakings. In response, the client sent two reports, a production and sales volumes report only, which were insufficient for the valuation requirements. A copy of this email is attached as Annexure 5. The executive head, Impact Investing, advised us to use the projections prepared by the incoming operator, as they were more reliable in determining future cash flows based on the due diligence process they had undertaken on SS refineries. The valuation was performed on the said forecast. A copy of the emails is attached as Annexure 6. As part of the handing over process to the external consultant, I also traveled with the investment associate from the deal team to Nakala to hand over the consultant's team to the refinery's management, as they had not yet visited the plant. This visit took place on the 8th of May 2018. During this visit, we handed the default letter to Mrs. Rasool, which we felt was important to do in person, to have them understand and acknowledge the contents of the letter, since email correspondence would usually be met with long periods of no response. A copy of this letter is attached as Annexure 7. At the time of this handover, we were also informed that the two managers who had been working at the plant had both left the country for personal reasons. This was again another indication of management instability, which raised further concern on an already difficult transaction. Mr. and Mrs. Rasool, however, committed to cooperating with the consultant's requests for technical, operational, and financial information, but over the ensuing weeks, they only made partial submissions to the consultants, which PMV was informed of. This lack of cooperation was not unusual, as we had also been challenged by the same behavior over the last few quarters. The consultant also sent a number of information requests to BDO, but similarly did not get much cooperation. The consultant's review process, therefore, was frustrated by lack of comprehensive engagement by the stakeholders, and against this background, they finalized their report with limitations mentioned. The recommendations from the consultant were to address key areas which were identified as improvement areas that would contribute to the turnaround of the refinery. These areas are governance and management, to install an effective board, to appoint strong executive management, attend to corporate governance and accountability, improve stakeholder communication, improve record keeping, policies and standard operation procedure documentation, and attend to risk, safety, and quality assurance frameworks. On financial management and production, highlighted was foreign exchange management, effective costing and pricing management, cash and working capital management, and ensuring the effective and efficient plant production management. Under sales and distribution, highlighted was the elimination of the reliance on a single client, diversifying sales channels, arm's length sales and distributions, and effective sales and marketing management, as well as an export strategy. The external
Can I stop you there? These recommendations, are you aware whether PIC was aware that these would need to be in place before entering into this transaction?
At this point, the report had not yet gone to PIC for adoption or consideration, and I refer to that in the next paragraph, that the final report, however, was not presented to the PMC, as another process had already been initiated by the non-executive board members and the deal team on the other side. And a presentation from that consultant is attached as Annexure 8. So these issues were identified, yes, but they were not necessarily conditions to the other process. The two were running parallel, and the first one to be adopted was the process which was being run by the deal team. Hence why this report never made it to the PIC committees for consideration.
And can you perhaps explain why the PIC was battling to get information from Rasool and them when PIC had two representatives on the board?
I think the issue that's prevalent here is that the lack of cooperation was from Mr. and Mrs. Rasool, and from where I sit now, it stems from a culture of not being corporatized. This is a businessman and his family who have been running this business without supervision, and therefore the entry of a financial institution with such comprehensive requirements was deemed burdensome by Mr. Rasool, and to the extent that at some point he did suggest that PIC should second resource, an accounting resource to the plant to cater for our reporting requirements. So I think all efforts were made internally from the transaction team and as well as at the board level, but there was just no traction from the sponsor. I don't think that they necessarily understand the value or the place of financial information to an institution or to a lender.
When the PMV inherited this transaction, would you have been aware of what CPs were in place at the time the disbursements were made or not?
Not to my recollection, no. At the time that I took over the transaction, I mean, the CPs would have been discharged already, and my role was to monitor the compliance going forward. So 2 years after the CPs have been signed, I don't actually recall what the CPs were to the transaction. I took the transaction forward on the basis of the legals and the reporting undertakings.
Can I ask, in essence, it does seem a bit contradictory to have two processes, one by yourselves and one by initiated separately, and then the one doesn't surface. Why on earth would that happen within one organization? Surely you would at the minimum combine the two and say, let's look at this from all angles. Why would that have occurred like that? Second of all, from beginning of this is a 2-year process from what I can see from what you're presenting, at least in fact slightly more, within which there's a steady deterioration around lack of information, lack of process, lack of governance, poor production, all of the stoppages. As a 70% shareholder, do you just accept that?
We don't necessarily accept it. We send out breach notices and default letters where there are defaults. And to answer your question one, why there was a parallel transaction running at the same time, the board members would have sought or deemed it fit to consider more than one option instead, I suppose, of waiting for the conclusion of this one. So whichever one would have materialized or come to fruition first would have been adopted, and the Vamara transaction seemed a better option. In this instance, what the recommendations were from the consultant were to attend to things that we already knew of and risks we already were aware of. They did not then get a chance to craft these recommendations into a specific strategy or work plan that is adoptable. So if the transaction team was running with the process that got to an advanced stage before we could conclude with this consultant process, I think it would have been prudent to have them conclude with the operator who's willing, an institutional operator who's willing to come in and turn the fortunes of this investment around.
What was the cost of the consultant?
I can't recall exactly, Commissioner, but I can provide that detail.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful because that is then commissioned for no purpose. Yeah. And I still am, I mean, I understand issuing notices, you've got a board, 2 years, and this happening, it just seems very slow as a process to deal with a dysfunctional organization that you've invested in and are the vast majority shareholder.
Commissioner, you are correct, and that the agility of the PIC in this instance was a bit slow. We generally seek to resolve issues first within our internal capacity, using our teams internally. But to the extent that a transaction exhibits characteristics that are beyond our scope to resolve, we then contract with external providers, and in this instance, that external provider provides all resources and attends specifically to that one distressed asset. The process would be slow in that we have to go through appointment RFP processes and wait for those processes to conclude. We have to onboard the external consultants and ensure that they have a common understanding from day one and hand them over to the client. So essentially, it's like handing over to another PMV team, which also must do its groundwork and lay the foundation before they can establish what are the remedial strategies that PIC can adopt. So it tends to take protracted length of time from our experience. But in some of the other investments, it would generally result in a positive outcome, whether it's been dealt internally or externally.
Do you not have a panel of service providers that have been through requests for proposals across a broad scope of things that you know you're going to need in different capacities?
I think we do have a panel, but in the instances of these, I think the procurement process would still warrant us to issue an RFP and conclude according to process. I don't think that it generally would translate into a quicker process because we have a panel. But that process, I think, can be provided for more context as to how exactly does it take place.
No, I don't want more information about how slow processes are. I'm much more interested in whether you've evaluated the consequence and are there ways to improve it? Because to sit with this problem for 2 years and come to the conclusion where you are, or to the situation where you are now, should warrant some internal review. Has there been any internal review about this particular transaction, about the process from beginning to end?
There has been a review, which is that we've identified that the challenge has been management, and therefore, with the transaction bringing in a new management operator, we are comfortable that it will look different and we will have a different experience with them. In terms of what PMV could have done better on this transaction, I believe, Commissioner, we tried various efforts to either deal with the executive management themselves or their auditor, but because of the to and fro from the different personnel, it presents a challenge in establishing or assessing what the financial position is, and to the extent that there is still value, we try and continue to pursue this information request. I'm not sure if I'm answering you.
Can you just remind me who the 2 non-executive members were on the board?
It would be Mr. Roy Rajda and Mr. Wellington Masekis.
And prior to that was?
They've always been those, and it's only been Mr. Rajda and Wellington on that transaction.
Wasn't Machima and Moore on? Was that a different?
I mean, is Mr. Rasool still operating there, or has he been pushed aside? What's happening?
Mr. Rasool has been asked to hand over everything and vacate from the premises. It's one of the conditions that the current operator expressly requested, that we ensure that he is off-site and he does not interfere with the operations. May I continue, Commissioner? Okay. Under the quarterly reporting of SS refineries, in summary, the reporting...
Sorry, I just do want to go No, that's fine. Go ahead.
The reporting process for this investment also follows the PMV processes outlined above. Well, this statement would have applied where I would have started with MST. Due to the client's lack of cooperation with information undertakings, the PMV's role in assessing this company was greatly constrained, and this was reported at all committee meetings relevant.
I just have to check. Annexure 8 on your document seems to be something different. Seems to be, from my copies, Busamet.
Apologies, Chair. That email contained both, this would have been one of the transactions in distress by being considered, but there is,
What should be on Annexure 8? What correct thing should be the document?
it would be the specific S&S report from the external consultant.
Who's the consultant, by the way, you said?
It was SABC next year.
Oh, it's the same company, but then this
Yes.
is a different, it's the same consultant, but a different company then?
Yes, they were allocated more than one transaction.
All right. So this is different to the KPMG report, is that the other one?
That's correct.
The other consultant, okay. Can we please then get the copy, the correct company?
My apologies,
The
I'll do
correct
that,
Yeah.
Commissioner. Thank you, sir.
All right.
And perhaps while you're doing that, I would just want to better understand the relationship of the board where you have Mr. Raja and Mr. Wellington Masikesa on, and para 51, which was the SPV created for the transaction, which had Mr. Machila and Ms. More on as the directors. Was the latter one simply a temporary process? What was the relationship between the board and this SPV board, and having 4 directors involved and this in 2 different capacities? I would just want to better understand the relationship between the two and what the role of those 4 non-exec directors appointed by the PIC were in relation to each other, and what oversight that provided. Thanks.
I will attend to it, Commissioner.
Weren't you going to respond to that question?
I wasn't sure if it's a request to answer to it now or to provide the details later.
You can answer now if you can.
No, if you are able to answer it, you're welcome.
Commissioner, I wouldn't have the details of the 2 board members being Dr. Dan and Ms. More on the other SPV, but for the intents of the transaction as S&S under unlisted, the board members would provide oversight. I suppose the peculiar instance is that the person who holds a board chairperson role also happens to be the executive head of that transaction, and therefore in escalating, the escalation would be 2-pronged. As the investment head, the executive head of the transaction team, as well as the chairperson, where he was dealt with as the executive head, it would be in reporting all the challenges we've identified. But further to that, the letter, which is annexed, I think, under, I think it's Annexure 7, would have been written now to him in his capacity as the chairperson to say over and above what we've tried to establish from the normal reporting challenges, we are requesting you as a chairperson to assist in getting us this information. Both approaches still did not give us the result that we needed, which is the information. Under the new strategic operator, upon conclusion of negotiations with the new managing operator, PMV was introduced to the Vamara team in October 2018 after they had officially taken over the refinery. At this meeting, we set out reporting requirements and discussed their implementation strategy, which included recruitment of key staff, working capital, rebranding the products, communicating with the statutory bodies in Mozambique, and distributing the product offering to a wider target market. Under Vamara's management, a significant difference in reporting has been noted. Vamara is attending to the legacy issues identified, and they're currently working on regularizing all the gaps and shortcomings of the previous manager. We have been informed that as of the 15th of March 2019, a shipment of 3,000 tons of crude palm oil has been offloaded at the refinery, and that production will commence once statutory compliance issues have been resolved.
Can I just ask a question on that? Because one of the issues has been the unreliability or the lack of consistency about supplies. It's interesting that there's reference to a shipload. Is there something in your monitoring that says these are the scheduled shiploads that would keep the production at a steady flow, that you don't have gaps in production, and what is the cost, and have you factored in the changing environment around that so that you know what is possible, that with a new management in place, there's actually a consistency of supply and at what kind of prices, so that you know what the turnaround could be if that is in place? Because this only refers to having one shipment. You know, if you've informed that a shipment has been offloaded, well, that's very well and good for one shipment. What happens thereafter? And how long does it take to process one shipment? If you need a schedule of delivery, do you have a schedule of delivery?
Thank you, Commissioner. We have used what Vamara has provided as their DD report to form now what will be the new base case of this transaction. And those details referring to at what capacity does the plant operate profitably, at what price would it need to sell the product, and at how many cycles, trading cycles, would it require to break even. Those details are provided in the DD report, and that's what we are now establishing as our baseline in terms of monitoring the performance of Vamara. They do have a schedule of shipments, and that can be provided. To my recollection, it will be a cycle of about 60 days from the time that they procure to the time that the product is ready for sales or for distribution. But I can check and provide that information, Commissioner, if you so require.
Yeah, I'm not asking for the schedule. I'm asking where do you know that there is a schedule and that it can meet the requirements of a sustained operation? I think that's really my question, that is in place as part of what is reorganizing. Giving us, we can have the copy of the schedule, but if it's not adhered to and you don't have money to pay, it doesn't help you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. There is a schedule, and because Vamara they are specifically funding the working capital, so the trade cycle will be financed by them. They have the liquidity, and as we're saying, because of that, we're establishing this as their DD as the baseline of our performance.
We've now received a document, workout and restructuring assessment in respect of SNS refineries. Where does that come?
Annexure 8.
Annexure what?
That's
Annexure 8.
Annexure 8 from
That's
the
Annexure
external
8.
consultant.
So can we discard the old one?
Yes, Commissioner.
Yes, thank you.
Sorry, Commissioner, can you come again?
No, I was saying yes, thank you. I suppose the witness is going to stand down now and we go back to Mr. Raja? Or what's the position?
She still needs to go through the recommendations and
All right, carry on.
Commissioner, may I propose that the recommendations are dealt with once the MST transaction has been discussed, because they would apply to trends that have been identified on both transactions.
Ms. Pui, what do you say to that?
that is fine, Commissioner. But I just have a few questions that I wanted to ask her.
I actually differ. I think that we can have the recommendations now, take them into account at this point, and when we look at the MST, we know that it's the same recommendations. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, Commissioner. I can proceed with the recommendations.
I would think so. We're in the middle of this. Let's conclude this. And all we note is that when we're looking at the MST, we then take these recommendations as the similar recommendations to that, so that we deal with it now. I would prefer that.
No, it's not. Okay. Commissioner, I will tend to the recommendations. Under the current under the current reporting frameworks, portfolio management for existing unlisted investments is not highly prioritized. Typically, PMC meetings prioritize investment approvals to the detriment of portfolio management of existing investments. PMC meetings are sometimes scheduled months after the relevant reporting quarter has passed, rendering some of the information outdated. In the instances
Sorry,
where
but who's responsible for that?
it would be scheduling of the company secretariat, but where they have afforded or specifically booked a meeting for PMV reports in particular, there are usually instances where the reports are either deferred to the end of a meeting because they are more pressing transaction approvals that must be dealt with, and or if we do get the chance to ventilate the issues, there's only sufficient time to go through the distressed section only, and not so much the other, maybe watch list and underperforming. So my recommendation is that there could be an improvement. This is an improvement area where the frequency of PMCs is increased and enough time is actually scheduled for discussion of at least the watch list or watch list and distressed investments, rather than just dealing with distressed, because it allows the PMV to express an opinion or an assessment on watch lists, so we can get guidance from those committees on how to proceed to resolve the issues before an investment deteriorates into distress.
If I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that there is insufficient attention to post-investment monitoring and evaluation and paying attention to how the assets are performing in relation to PMC. And has this been escalated from PMC to higher echelons in the organization, raising it with the CEO, even with the board, to say, listen, you know, we may be making investments, but we're not necessarily managing them to the most effective?
It has been escalated to the extent that the fund investment panels now also have quarterly scheduled meetings for PMV reports. However, the challenge is that we cannot proceed to submit to the fund the higher governance structures if a PMC has not taken place. Hence, my specific focus is that the starting point should be sufficient time be afforded to the PMV team to discuss or table what we find as in our monitoring activities to the extent that it assists to arrest some of these problems before they deteriorate further, and also to assist in the consideration of new transactions as they come on board.
Just to again clarify then, the lessons learnt in the investment process by the monitoring and evaluation is not passed on to new transactions sufficiently.
Correct, Chair.
Just a question from my side. In terms of PMV, how many companies do you look after, roughly? In terms of, work monitoring, workout, distress, the total?
Commissioner, I think as at the December quarter, we have slightly over 100 investments that we look after. Of those, I'm hesitant to give a specific number of which ones are distressed or what percentage
just roughly
is
we can
distressed.
get, just roughly, and then we can get the correct numbers, just to get a sense.
I think less than 15% in terms of the value would be classified as distressed. And that's at the global portfolio. The other would be in watch list, and then the others are either performing or underperforming.
Yeah. And how big is your team? Looking at 100 companies, how big is your team? Is the team?
We currently have 3 managers, so on average, each manager looks after about 30 transactions. There are 7 associates, and on average, they're looking at about 15 to 18 investments. But some may have more because, as I mentioned earlier, the sectors, some sectors deploy faster than others.
Yeah. And are you coping, with these companies, you guys?
Commissioner, I'm happy that you asked, because that would be the last recommendation that I mentioned, is that it would be beneficial if the team's capacity could be enhanced either by adding more resources in the PMV team or creating a separate workout and restructuring unit whose main focus is to deal with the distressed assets. I think that separation would really assist, because we find that for those transactions that are now in distress, they tend to occupy a lot of the time in terms of chasing after and ensuring compliance and engaging with the management teams of those companies. So it also is a potential problem in that we also then tend to maybe not necessarily prioritize, but rather more attention is given to distress and versus watching the entire portfolio closely. So a separate team, I believe, for workout and restructuring could be an operating model that could be considered going forward.
Then the next question is, from the 100 businesses or so, what percentage roughly would you say are performing, and then the watch list and the other categories, if you can, and then we can get the correct numbers,
Commissioner, I
the
think
precise numbers after that.
the percentage of performing is slightly above, it's around, let me say, around 60%.
All right, that sounds not bad.
And
then watch list, so we said about 60% is performing, like 15% is distressed.
the balance would be split now, so
Between
the
watch
between
list
watch
and-
list and underperforming.
The underperforming, roughly the same or different numbers?
No, the watch list, I think it tends to be bigger, maybe.
To be more than the
Yes.
underperforming?
More than the underperforming.
All right,
yes.
can we please get some correct numbers on that one? Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for your side.
Commissioner, my last recommendation would be as it relates to the current infrastructure, which is the IT infrastructure, which we rely on. Presently, we have more of a manual process or storage mechanism, and it would be beneficial to have an automated system or an electronic system where most of the static detail of transactions are loaded, and where some of these issues or tracking areas could be assisted by a system that automatically highlights or flags what is due, when it's due. We currently have to rely on a different source documents, for example, in terms of keeping track of what is happening in the portfolio. So my recommendation, which is something that is already, I believe, being explored, is to install and to implement a system that enables efficient tracking and monitoring of these transactions, because some of the monitoring efforts are sometimes they fall through the cracks because there are so many things to attend to and no particular system to rely on except your own organizational skills.
Just to follow up, in terms of the valuations, where are they done? You know, it's 100 companies, it's quite a lot. So who does that and where are they done? And is there sort of a common template, or each company has got to be done differently and all that?
Thank you, Commissioner. The valuations are done by the finance team, also called the valuations team. That team directly reports to the GM of finance, and he reports to the CFO. In terms of whether they use a template or not, each valuation is dictated to by the nature of the investment. Where it's a loan, there's a standard loan valuation. Where it's equity, it's a combination of the different valuation methods. But in terms of presentation, they are presented in similar format.
And do they do those internally, or they tend to get other people to help, external help?
Commissioner, the finance team does three quarters out of the year. They conduct the valuations internally. It's the final year-end value that is contracted to external valuers for independence purposes. So of 3 quarters, it would be June, September, and December, which are done internally. And then the March one is the one which is outsourced as the final year-end figure.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you.
I want to take you back to paragraph 55. The recommendations from the consultant. Is it normal, have you come across a transaction where the PIC has invested in a company and there's no governance, like it's still a one-man show, and PIC invests that much money, and I mean, there's a list here in paragraph 55 of that have been highlighted as improvement areas. Have you come across a transaction like this one?
In terms of size, not necessarily, but in terms of the management problem, we do tend to see that the companies that usually are family-owned exhibit the same pattern, where I've mentioned earlier that it's an issue of, for lack of a better word, rehabilitating or onboarding them and corporatizing them. there's a corrective action plan that is for such companies, a corrective action plan that's agreed to by the ESG department, where governance risks are highlighted right at inception, and they're given timelines, for example, to reconstitute the boards, to appoint board subcommittees, to establish policies and frameworks, but those responsibilities are dealt specifically under the ESG function. So the trend is there, yes, for some of this family-run investments, but they are corrected through that mechanism. SNS is one of them, yes.
Are you aware whether the PIC thought that far before they entered this transaction or not? Because I understand you inherited this transaction. Are you aware whether this was one of the things that PIC thought about before they entered into this transaction or not?
I think by virtue of approving a sponsor with a single off-taker, those considerations were made, and the risks might have been flagged as something that is medium or can be mitigated through processes. I have not seen the actual corrective action plan that would have been agreed to by ESG to address the issues, but the fact that the transaction was approved with a one-man show means they had assessed that risk as something that is mitigatable.
Sorry, I'm just not very clear about the consultant and then the other consultant. Who was the first consultant that you used?
It was SABC next year.
Okay, so that's the annexure in Annexure 8.
Yes, Commissioner.
And the consultant report that was actually approved, where is that? Or the one that was implemented, that was initiated by the non-executive board members, where is that?
That would be the Vamara transaction. It is not annexed in this statement.
Can we get a copy of that so that we can actually see what the proposal is from them? Because that's the one that's been implemented as the new management and possible partner.
Yes.
It would just be useful to see that as well. And then in the information requested by KPMG for its year-end valuation, did that ever materialize?
For the 20...
You talked about here at March 2018 where you wanted to complete the valuation. If you looked at paragraph 49, 50, was that information ever forthcoming?
For the purposes of valuation, we used, or rather the valuations department used the forecasts provided by this new operator.
Okay, because as I understood it, your fourth quarter for valuation purposes was external, and that was KPMG.
Yes.
Did they ever succeed in giving you an evaluation, a proper valuation?
KPMG did conduct the valuation. However, it wasn't based on information provided by Mr. Rasool. It was based now on forecasts that had been provided by the incoming operator, as they were they established to be more reliable.
Okay. So they weren't on actuals, they were on forecasts that he anticipated, or the new operator anticipated being the case.
Yes, Chair.
Okay. That's fine by me.
Thank you, Commissioner. That is the evidence of Ms. Matsikanda. Can I request a short adjournment when we prepare Mr. Roy Raja to come back for MSD?
May I just mention that when he does come back, there might be a few questions still on SNS. Okay? How long do you want?
15 minutes. 15 minutes.
15, that's fine.
Thank you.
We'll adjourn for 15 minutes.
To address the question of the parallel processes that we're running concurrently, and he's ready to do that.
And there might be further questions, not necessarily just that one alone. Mr. Raja, can I just remind you, you took the oath earlier on? You're still under oath.
Yes.
You can carry on with what Advocate Pua said you will.
Chair, my understanding is that the question is the PMV unit running a process of a business review as well as the team following a process of dealing with Vamara. I just wanted to indicate that the process of working with Vamara started in 2017. So it's been quite a lengthy process, also because it had to involve the other lenders, the Mozambican banks. So we had already identified, as you'll recall from my testimony earlier, that we wanted to get in place a strategic equity partner. So hence, we had started that process, and to the point where we've brought it to the point where they are operating, and within the next 6 months, we are pursuing where they become involved in the equity of the transaction. So ours had been a process that had been well before commissioned before the PMV team.
Given that it was well underway, would you not have discussed with the PMV team that this is the process? Is it necessary to do a second evaluation or to refine or redefine what should come out of that second evaluation that would feed into your process? Why two parallel processes that don't seem to talk to each other?
Through you, Commissioner, yes, we would have discussed that with them, but importantly for us on the investment team, we look at the post-investment team as a, let's call it a control measure. We don't want to dictate to them what they should do. Let them establish for themselves what the issues are, and those issues we would feed into the process with Vamara, and I think that is what the PMV team had done as well.
In that regard, if one looks at the recommendations that have just been made by Ms. Madzikanda, have you had discussions with the PMV team about that kind of changes that are made, the kind of work that is being done? If you looked at the consideration about the attention given to post-investment activities, surely that should be something that you pay particular attention to. I mean, are you surprised by what is being said? Are you aware of what has been said? And if you are aware, what have you done about it?
Through you, Commissioner, yes, there is discussions, and remember the PMV team also presents to the different committees, PMC, the fund investment panels, and that's so we are fit. We also contribute in terms of where we think things can also be improved in terms of, for example, if we take the operating model, the question is, if you're doing monitoring, should monitoring rather be at least some of it outsourced and pay more attention to work out and value add? These are matters that have been discussed. The issues are in terms of the amount of transactions that they have. Should we rather have a cutoff point within PIC where we, from a certain value upwards, we deal directly, a certain value below we use intermediaries, so you're not sitting with a high volume of small value transactions, would make it very uneconomical. So I mean the next transaction, which is MST, which was 21 million rand, is that too low? Is that something that should be done to others so that they have the ratio of number of deals per associate is not that high? So there are various discussions that we have with the PMV team.
That doesn't help me very much. that does not give clarity about whether you are comfortable with the level that it is at the moment, or whether that is functioning, and yes, to say there are ongoing discussions, that isn't what's come across today. What's come across today is that it's inadequate, to me.
Yes, I would agree that at the moment it's inadequate. I think they probably need more capacity in the PMV unit, because I think as you have so many transactions per person, they're spreading themselves too thin. And especially when it gets into a workout stage, the amount of work you put in is very intensive. So I'd agree.
If I could perhaps just ask you then, as a non-exec director, one of the two non-exec directors on the S&S refineries, if we listen to both the presentations today, this really sounds like, I mean, it's not exactly something that you would write home about as a successful venture. To what degree, as a non-executive board member, would you feel the role could have been different, should have been different, and how this would influence you going forward? This took, a lot of time, a lot of effort. As you said, one of your first ventures into the continent from your section, and it doesn't come across as something that the PIC has looked at its investment and the results that would have done you sort of given you a very good record in your first venture. How have you assessed it? What have you looked at in the role in particular as the representatives of the PIC, the two of you as non-exec board members?
Yes, through you, Commissioner. This has been a very difficult investment for us. It was the first one. Now, you have, as I mentioned earlier, the key reason for it going wrong is it's a strong devaluation in the currency. But then this just becomes compounded when you're dealing with a sponsor that is not very cooperative. We had identified that governance is where we should look at improving. We tried many things. We tried co-opting the banks even to come onto the board, but as a lender they were not prepared to do so. So there were a lot of difficulties for us. I think as a PMV team has alluded, maybe the issue in terms of family-owned businesses, if you're getting involved, maybe we need to have a closer look at that, because that is where you might have resistance in terms of governance. But these were all picked up in hindsight at the point of doing the appraisal. We had commissioned relevant experts. We were comfortable at that point in time. But clearly in this particular case, it was like a perfect storm. Everything that could go wrong went wrong in the investment. But I think that having said that, we've spent quite a bit of time. It may have taken a long time to bring Vamara into where we are today, but I'm confident that from here on there wouldn't be an issue. I think that the question was raised about the sustainability of procurement of the oil and the sales, that we are confident that you would not have the stop-start or the intermittent supplying in the market, because clearly that's a problem.
Yeah. All right. So the one question I wanted to ask is, it's sort of workout versus value add, and I'm not sure it's probably you or the other lady, Matikan. So where does the value add happen in these companies? Sort of, is it the non-executive director's role, or is it the PMV role?
Through you, Commissioner, I think it's a combination of both, but first and foremost it has to be the investment team. That was their investment. So with the representation on the board, I think that's where strategic input should be given. Obviously in the PMV side, because they're working on a number of transactions that might have similar characteristics. There would be learnings from there that we could apply and value add. So I think, for example, on the PMV side, they have done quite a bit of work in the healthcare sector and the affordable housing sector, because we had done transactions in there. So they developed lessons learned that we can apply in other projects. So I think it's a combination between working between both teams.
Perhaps just a couple of others. Given that the introduction to this entity was through Siyabonga Nene by the CIO at the time, Mr. Machila, was that interpreted how was that interpreted in terms of process? Is it something that when you're looking at the due diligence, when you're looking at you should go ahead, was there any question that this would be something that was desired or accepted, that you do a proper due diligence anyway?
Thank you. As I mentioned earlier, that if this project had come in through the normal processes, we would have looked at it anyway because of the significant commitment in terms financially and monetary-wise from the sponsor. So the issue of Mr. Nene being involved would not have affected our decision on whether to take it through the process. On a preliminary basis, we would have still felt that we should proceed with the transaction.
And then, to the best of your knowledge, do you know if Mr. Nene, given the dispute and the role of the PIC in trying to resolve this fee and the amount of roughly $5 million, do you know if Mr. Nene got any of that money?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know of that. All I know is that whenever there was an issue in terms of the settlement of the $3.3 million, the pestering always came from Mr. Mirza. As I mentioned at the meeting at the Fire and Ice, that was the last time I'd ever seen Mr. Nene or ever interacted with him.
What are the lessons that you would say you've learned as a non-exec director?
I think perhaps the lesson learned here is probably if you're going out into a new country, I think probably spend a lot of more time in terms of the assessment of the jockey in the project, the person spearheading the project, as well as looking at probably the issue again of to what extent do we realistically think that we can corporatize a family-owned business. I think that would be the key lessons that we would have learned.
And can you, as a final question, can you tell me the role of EcoBank?
EcoBank had provided a letter of credit facility to SNS Refinery. It's a working capital facility.
Did the PIC have any role in getting that loan made? Because it was EcoBank Nigeria, EcoBank Mozambique.
Yes, the PIC had spoken to EcoBank, and given that we do have an investment in EcoBank, so we did play a role in trying to facilitate the letter of credit.
Do you do that often? Because I mean, if you're a big shareholder in EcoBank, can they say no to you when you're trying to assist, when you're trying to get letters of credit or other investments or loans made?
Look, in investments where we can play a role in facilitating something of the nature with EcoBank, we would do that. So sometimes even in transactions where we think we can co-opt, for example, the IDC in terms of providing follow-on investment, it's something that we would do.
And in that circumstance, do they rely on the work that you have done as the investment, on the investment or do they repeat what you've done, or do they take your work as the validation that, yes, the work has been done and they can make that investment?
No, they don't place reliance on us. In fact, where they do happen to use our assessment, there we have a non-reliance letter that is signed between the parties.
A non-reliance letter doesn't actually mean they don't rely. It means that they can't hold you liable for it.
Yes, but usually you find, with that they must perform their own independent evaluation and not rely on the work that we have done.
Do you know if they did it in the case of SNS?
They wouldn't have done in the case of SNS. No, they wouldn't have relied on us.
Wouldn't have relied on you, and they would have done their own assessment of the letter of credits?
Yes.
And you're sure of that?
Yes.
They did that work?
As far as I'm aware, because they never came to us to ask for, they had asked us a lot of questions in terms of the company and the business and information, but as far as I'm aware, they had gone through their own process, and that is why, in fact, it actually took quite a long time for them to approve it.
Can we just get clarity from EcoBank that they actually did their own assessment and took their own decision of the letter of credit?
We'll get that.
Will do so.
All right, can I just ask something not really related to the two matters that you are here for? If an employee, I understand, and tell me if I'm wrong, that an employee of PIC can introduce somebody who wants to transact with the PIC, am I correct?
Yes, any employee in PIC, they can originate a transaction, but if we look at it specifically, it will be in the deal team that would originate transactions, yes. It's part of their responsibility.
And if an employee has done that and the transaction passes, it's successful, does the employee get a transaction fee?
No, the employee does not get a transaction fee. Where it would reflect will be in the employee's balance scorecard.
Purposes of bonus?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Just a question, to add on lessons learned, by you guys. Just in terms of the fees paid, the 1.75 million and also the sort of supposedly $3.3 million and all that. What would you say, from your point of view, are the lessons learned around fees and referral fees and advisory fees and all that?
Yes, I think with regards to advisory fees, I think the lesson is let's rather have a very concise guideline or policy on it, so it avoids a lot of discretion, would be the one thing. The second thing would be, to what extent should that be the cost for the client? As far as possible, we should actually pass on the cost to the borrower. That is what I would say. So let it be a cost to the borrower, not to the PIC.
And the quantums and the percentages too, what can you say about that?
I think with regards to the quantums, the principle should be that the higher the amount, the lower the percentage. And I think probably also there should be an absolute cap. So I think, if somebody is going to come with 10 billion rand, and let's say you're saying it's 0.5%, I still think it should be subject to a cap, a monetary cap. Because the amount of work done, there's a certain extent to which you can argue that the higher the amount, the higher the fee. But also you got to bear in mind, sometimes regardless of the size of the transaction, some of the costs would be fixed.
So meaning that you are saying if you are funding a consortium, they must carry their own costs. They cannot take the cost of the transaction from the funding which they raise from the PIC. Is that what you're saying? Because some consortiums might not have the money to pay for those costs.
Through you, Commissioner. No, I think that we should allow for that, but I think what we don't want to do is for us to, it must be subject to success, but that necessarily means that where the consortium appoints its own service providers, they have to make sure either if they don't have the money, those service providers have to work on risk. But working on risk necessarily means that the cost goes up. That's the only downside to it. Commissioner, if you'll allow me, there was a question that was asked to Ms. Constance regarding the directorship of Dr. Majila in the SPV and Ms. More in relation to myself and Mr. Masikesa. So I'd like to answer that. So as I mentioned in my testimony, if you are an equity holder and a debt provider, it has to be in different legal entities. So the appointment of Ms. More and Dr. Majila is only for statutory purposes because a company cannot not have directors. So, but that is only for the purposes of the loan funding coming into the SPV and flowing out to SNS refinery. But so that they are representatives of the lender, if I may put it that way. And then with regards to Mr. Masikesa and myself, we would be the PIC nominees on the operating entity, that is SNS refinery.
Does the SPV then dissolve?
No, the SPV
Still remains all the time?
The SPV will remain until all obligations have been discharged. Yes.
So basically you have 2 directors for the SPV and 2 for the board.
Yes.
And the SPV directors have very little function other than to enable that funding to take place.
Yes, and then the annual sign-off of the annual financial statements.
Okay.
Yeah, last question from my side. I just need to understand some of the technical stuff a bit on the valuation of the company, the SNS. The $18 million that the PIC paid, did Mr. Rasool actually put in his own equity before then, or was the company funded by debt? So I'm just saying, I mean, 45% for 18 million, what is the total valuation? What, 43 million, somewhere there? I don't know. So I just explain to us how the equity worked out, and then did he fund this through the equity or it was just loans? Because then it means the balance sheet didn't have a lot of sort of the equity portion.
Yes, so it would have been Mr. Rasool putting up his $22 million of equity, and then the PIC was $18 million, so that was the 40 million. So I think the 18 out of the 40 is 45%. Is that how it arrived?
So there was some money put in by him in terms of the risk,
Yes.
the equity, and then he raised loans to supplement that.
Yes, as I indicated earlier, the first step was he had a fair amount of the loans in his personal capacity, so it came in as shareholder loans, but later what we had done, we had brought in the Mozambican banks directly on the balance sheet, so he would have had shareholder loans. So what we had done in the final stage is the shareholder loans would have been converted into equity.
I just want to find out, during this period, was former CEO Dan Majila a board member of EcoBank?
I know he was a member of the board. I don't know the period but I have a feeling it may have been it would have coincided with this period.
I'm just going to also take you back to the recommendations that Ms. Matsiganda spoke about in paragraph 55 of her statement, where she was talking about the recommendations that were addressed. I had asked a question to your colleague, Mr. Masekesa, last week, because I heard you speaking about the appraisal report. I asked him a question last week, and he said you would be able to answer this. And the question was, in the appraisal report, there are all the different departments normally say what the risks are, and they would suggest CPs. And in one of the documents, though I don't have it right now, my apologies for that, governance and management and operation was one of the highlights that was said. There should be a government structure that is set up before PIC invests in this transaction. And when you were just testifying now, you said you had comfort. Can you just explain why you found it comfortable to still invest in this one-man show regardless of the risks that were raised at that particular point in time?
In terms of, through your comment, in terms of governance, we had always envisaged applying the governance that we have in South Africa in terms of an audit committee, social and ethics, audit and risk, and so forth. And that there you'd find that in Mozambique, for that matter, you don't have those. In fact, even if it comes to an audit, to a certain threshold, they've never, it wasn't a requirement for companies to be audited. But we thought, let's go in there, and we will try and change this over a period of time. But that has been one of the things where you find governance is not easily embraced or not understood or not valued. I think probably more so it's not valued the way I see it. But look, initially, well, we just started with the board of 4. We didn't want to layer it with too much of cost. We were going to slowly introduce the issue of having fully fledged governance, but you had the stop-start type of arrangement. So the company was not, it wouldn't have been of sufficient size to justify it. In the interim, we had tried to also co-opt the Mozambican banks, but they were not comfortable in terms of coming on board.
Thank you, Commissioner. We're now going to move to the MST transaction.
I think it would be more convenient to do that tomorrow morning. Right? So who will you start with Mr. Raja or with Ms. Matsiganda?
We'll start with Mr. Raja.
Are you happy with us adjourning now?
I'm not. I was hoping we could proceed until 7 o'clock, but
That's too ambitious. I think it would be convenient to adjourn. We'll adjourn until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
kwano ka dipuputsong tsa komishene e ikemetseng.
Okay, I sent it to you. Please give them to him. SMS. Yeah, they catch me, yeah.
Can I have audio?
1212. Hello.
Thank you.
I don't have Tony's number. I've sent them to you. Can you send them to someone? I don't know who. I did. I sent them to her already.
She didn't respond. Let me call her. Heidi. Yes.
Hi.
Heidi just sent you questions. We'll submit.
Because it's standard procedure to send questions.
Okay, thank you. She got them. Hello? So, sharp is it? Sharp. Hey, don't let them go to change anything. Let them go to change anything. Maybe I said it, it's not like you can phone them.
Warren, what was Sharon? What is Sharon at the PIC? Okay. Yeah, but she said Sharon here.
How long to ask?
So must just call her Constance? Yeah. Okay, but what does she do at the PIC? The portfolio manager.
Yeah, but at first investment. She manages the investments or manages the investments after